Do the dead appear at noon? In the leafy paths of Kensington Gardens, where Victorian ladies take their morning walks, one woman feels an impossible touch. Not in darkness, but in searching daylight. Not with terror, but with recognition that defies reason. Someone watches her from behind curtained windows, measuring time with a doctor's patience. Family ties can bind or strangle, and some kinds of protection leave no visible trace. Wilkie Collins crafts a story where morning sunshine holds more mysteries than midnight, where what cannot be seen might prove more solid than shadow, and where the line between protection and possession blurs in the space between heartbeats. My name is Tony Walker. Welcome to the Classic Ghost Stories podcast. Join us for Mrs. Zant and the Ghost by Wilkie Collins, where daylight offers no refuge from what waits beyond the veil.
Everybody dies, don't they?
Mrs. Zant and the Ghost by Wilkie Collins. 1. The course of this narrative describes the return of a disembodied spirit to earth and leads the reader on new and strange ground. Not in the obscurity of midnight, but in the searching light of day did the supernatural influence assert itself. Neither revealed by a vision, nor announced by a voice, it reached mortal knowledge through the sense which is least easily self-deceived, the sense that feels. The record of this event will of necessity produce conflicting impressions. It will raise in some minds the doubt which reason asserts. It will invigorate in other minds the hope which faith justifies, and it will leave the terrible question of the destinies of man where centuries of vain investigation have left it, in the dark. Having only undertaken in the present narrative to lead the way along a succession of events, the writer declines to follow modern examples by thrusting himself and his opinions on the public view. He returns to the shadow from which he has emerged, and leaves the opposing forces of incredulity and belief to fight the old battle over again, on the old ground. 2. The events happened soon after the first 30 years of the present century had come to an end. On a fine morning, early in the month of April, a gentleman of middle age named Rayburn took his little daughter Lucy out for a walk in the woodland pleasure ground of western London called Kensington Gardens. The few friends whom he possessed reported of Mr. Rayburn, not unkindly, that he was a reserved and solitary man. He might have been more accurately described as a widower devoted to his only surviving child. Although he was not more than 40 years of age, the one pleasure which made life enjoyable to Lucy's father was offered by Lucy herself. Playing with her ball, the child ran on to the southern limit of the gardens, at that part of it which still remains nearest to the old palace of Kensington. Observing close at hand one of these spacious covered seats called in England alcoves, Mr. Rayburn was reminded that he had the morning's newspaper in his pocket, and that he might do so well as to rest and read. At that early hour the place was a solitude. "Go on playing, my dear," he said, "but take care to keep where I can see you." Lucy tossed up her ball, and Lucy's father opened his newspaper. He had not been reading for more than 10 minutes when he felt a familiar little hand laid on his knee. "Tired of playing?" he inquired, with his eyes still on the newspaper. "I'm frightened, Papa." He looked up directly. The child's pale face startled him. He took her on his knee and kissed her. "You oughtn't to be frightened, Lucy, when I'm with you," he said gently. "What is it?" He looked out of the alcove as he spoke and saw a little dog among the trees. "Is it the dog?" he asked. Lucy answered, "It's not the dog. It's the lady." The lady was not visible from the alcove. "Has she said anything to you?" Mr. Rayburn inquired. "No." "What has she done to frighten you?" The child put her arms round her father's neck. "Whisper, Papa," she said. "I'm afraid of her hearing us." I think she's mad." "Why do you think so, Lucy?" "She came near to me. I thought she was going to say something. She seemed to be ill." "Well, and what then?" "She looked at me." There Lucy found herself at a loss how to express what she had to say next, and took refuge in silence. "Nothing very wonderful so far," her father suggested. "Yes, papa, but she didn't seem to see me when she looked." "Well, and what happened then?" "The lady was frightened, and that frightened me, I think," the child repeated positively. "She's mad." It occurred to Mr. Raeburn that the lady might be blind. He rose at once to set the doubt at rest. "Wait here," he said, "and I'll come back to you." But Lucy clung to him with both hands. Lucy declared that she was afraid to be by herself. They left the alcove together. The new point of view at once revealed the stranger leaning against the trunk of a tree. She was dressed in the deep mourning of a widow. The pallor of her face, the glassy stare in her eyes, more than accounted for the child's terror. It excused the alarming conclusion at which she had arrived. "Go nearer to her," Lucy whispered. They advanced a few steps. It was now easy to see that the lady was young and wasted by illness, but, arriving at a doubtful conclusion perhaps under present circumstances, apparently possessed of rare personal attractions in happier days. As the father and daughter advanced a little, she discovered them. After some hesitation, she left the tree, approached with an evident intention of speaking, and suddenly paused. A change to astonishment and fear animated her vacant eyes. If it had not been plain before, it was now beyond all doubt that she was not a poor blind creature, deserted and helpless. At the same time, the expression of her face was not easy to understand. She could hardly have looked more amazed and bewildered if the two strangers who were observing her had suddenly vanished from the place in which they stood. Mr. Raeburn spoke to her with the utmost kindness of voice and manner. "I'm afraid you're not well," he said. "Is there anything that I can do?" The next words were suspended on his lips. It was impossible to realize such a state of things, but the strange impression that she had already produced on him was now confirmed. If he could believe his senses, her face did certainly tell him that he was invisible and inaudible to the woman whom he had just addressed. She moved slowly away with a heavy sigh, like a person disappointed and distressed. Following her with his eyes, he saw the dog once more, a little smooth-coated terrier of the ordinary English breed. The dog showed none of the restless activity of his race. With his head down and his tail depressed, he crouched like a creature paralyzed by fear. His mistress roused him by a call. He followed her listlessly as she turned away. After walking a few paces only, she suddenly stood still. Mr. Raeburn heard her talking to herself. "Did I feel it again?" she said, as if perplexed by some doubt that awed or grieved her. After a while, her arms rose slowly and opened with a gentle caressing action, an embrace strangely offered to the empty air. "No," she said to herself sadly, after waiting a moment. "More perhaps when tomorrow comes. More today." She looked up at the clear blue sky. "The beautiful sunlight, the merciful sunlight," she murmured. "I should have died if it had happened in the dark." Once more she called to the dog, and once more she walked slowly away. "Is she going home, Papa?" the child asked. "We will try and find out," the father answered. He was by this time convinced that the poor creature was in no condition to be permitted to go out without someone to take care of her. From motives of humanity, he was resolved on making the attempt to communicate with her friends. 3. The lady left the gardens by the nearest gate, stopping to lower her veil before she turned into the busy thoroughfare which leads to Kensington. Advancing a little way along the High Street, she entered a house of respectable appearance, with a card in one of the windows, which announced that apartments were to let. Mr. Raeburn waited a minute, then knocked at the door, and asked if he could see the mistress of the house. The servant showed him into a room on the ground floor, neatly but scantily furnished. One little white object varied the grim brown monotony of the empty table. It was a visiting card. With a child's unceremonious curiosity, Lucy pounced on the card and spelt the name letter by letter. Z-A-N-T, she repeated. What does that mean? Her father looked at the card as he took it away from her and put it back on the table. The name was printed and the address was added in pencil. Mr. John Zant, Purley's Hotel. The mistress made her appearance. Mr. Raeburn heartily wished himself out of the house again the moment he saw her. The ways in which it is possible to cultivate the social virtues are more numerous and more varied than is generally supposed. This lady's way had apparently accustomed her to meet her fellow creatures on the hard ground of justice without mercy. Something in her eyes, when she looked at Lucy, said, "I wonder whether that child gets punished when she deserves it." "Do you wish to see the rooms which I have to let?" she began. Mr. Raeburn at once stated the object of his visit, as clearly, as civilly, and as concisely as a man could do it. He was conscious, he added, that he had been guilty perhaps of an act of intrusion. The manner of the mistress of the house showed that she entirely agreed with him. He suggested, however, that his motive might excuse him. The mistress's manner changed, and asserted a difference of opinion. "I know the lady whom you mention," she said, "is a person of the highest respectability, in delicate health. She has taken my first-floor apartments with excellent references, and she gives remarkably little trouble. I have no claim to interfere with her proceedings, and no reason to doubt that she is capable of taking care of herself." Mr. Raeburn unwisely attempted to say a word in his own defence. "Allow me to remind you," he began. "Of what, sir?" "What I observed when I happened to see the lady in Kensington Gardens."
"I am not responsible for what you observed in Kensington Gardens. If your time is of any value, pray don't let me detain you."
Dismissed in those terms, Mr. Raeburn took Lucy's hand and withdrew. He had just reached the door when it was opened from the outer side. The lady of Kensington Gardens stood before him. In the position which he and his daughter now occupied, their backs were towards the window. Would she remember having seen them for a moment in the gardens? "Excuse me for intruding on you," she said to the landlady. "Your servant tells me my brother-in-law called when I was out. He sometimes leaves a message on his card." She looked for the message and appeared to be disappointed. There was no writing on the card. Mr. Raeburn lingered a little in the doorway on the chance of hearing something more. The landlady's vigilant eyes discovered him.
"Do you know this gentleman?" she said maliciously to her lodger.
Not that I remember." Replying in those words, the lady looked at Mr. Raeburn for the first time, and suddenly drew back from him. "Yes," she said, correcting herself. I think we met." Her embarrassment overpowered her. She could say no more. Mr. Raeburn compassionately finished the sentence for her. "We met accidentally in Kensington Gardens," he said. She seemed to be incapable of appreciating the kindness of his motive. After hesitating a little, she addressed a proposal to him, which seemed to show distrust of the landlady. "Will you let me speak to you upstairs in my own room?" she asked. Without waiting for a reply, she led the way to the stairs. Mr. Raeburn and Lucy followed. They were just beginning the ascent to the first floor, when the spiteful landlady left the lower room and called to her lodger over their heads,
"Take care what you say to this man, Mrs. Zant. He thinks you're mad."
Mrs. Zant turned round on the landing and looked at him. Not a word fell from her lips. She suffered, she feared, in silence. Something in the sad submission of her face touched the springs of innocent pity in Lucy's heart. The child burst out crying. That artless expression of sympathy drew Mrs. Zant down the few stairs which separated her from Lucy. "May I kiss your dear little girl?" she said to Mr. Raeburn. The landlady, standing on the mat below, expressed her opinion of the value of caresses as compared with a sounder method of treating young persons in tears.
"If that child was mine," she remarked, "I'd give her something to cry for."
In the meantime, Mrs. Zant led the way to her rooms. The first words she spoke showed that the landlady had succeeded but too well in prejudicing her against Mr. Raeburn. "Will you let me ask your child," she said to him, "why you think me mad?" He met this strange request with a firm answer. You don't know yet what I really do think. Will you give me a minute's attention? No, she said positively. The child pities me. I want to speak to the child. What did you see me do in the gardens, my dear, that surprised you? Lucy turned uneasily to her father. Mrs. Zant persisted. I first saw you by yourself, and then I saw you with your father, she went on. When I came nearer to you, did I look very oddly, as if I didn't see you at all? Lucy hesitated again, and Mr. Rayburn interfered. You're confusing my little girl, he said. Allow me to answer your questions, or excuse me if I leave you. There was something in his look or in his tone that mastered her. She put her hand to her head. I don't think I'm fit for it, she answered vacantly. My courage has been sorely tried already. If I can get a little rest and sleep, you may find me a different person. I'm left a great deal by myself, and I have reasons for trying to compose my mind. Can I see you tomorrow, or write to you? Where do you live? Mr. Rayburn laid his card on the table in silence. She had strongly excited his interest. He honestly desired to be of some service to this forlorn creature, abandoned so cruelly as it seemed to her own guidance. But he had no authority to exercise, no sort of claim to direct her actions, even if she consented to accept his advice. As a last resource, he ventured on an allusion to the relative of whom she had spoken downstairs. When do you expect to see your brother-in-law again? He said. I don't know, she answered. I should like to see him. He's so kind to me. She turned aside to take leave of Lucy. Goodbye, my little friend. If you live to grow up, I hope you'll never be such a miserable woman as I am. She suddenly looked round at Mr. Rayburn. Have you got a wife at home? She asked. My wife is dead. And you have a child to comfort you. Please leave me. You harden my heart. Oh, sir, don't you understand? You make me envy you. Mr. Rayburn was silent when he and his daughter were out in the street again. Lucy, as became a dutiful child, was silent too. But there are limits to human endurance, and Lucy's capacity for self-control gave way at last. Are you thinking of the lady, Papa? She said. He only answered by nodding his head. His daughter had interrupted him at that critical moment in a man's reflections when he is on the point of making up his mind. Before they were home again, Mr. Rayburn had arrived at a decision. Mr. Zant's brother-in-law was evidently ignorant of any serious necessity for his interference, or he would have made arrangements for immediately repeating his visit. In this state of things, if any evil happened to Mrs. Zant, silence on Mr. Rayburn's part might indirectly be to blame for a serious misfortune. Arriving at that conclusion, he decided upon running the risk of being rudely received for the second time by another stranger. Leaving Lucy under the care of her governess, he went at once to the address that had been written on the visiting card left at the lodging-house, and sent in his name. A courteous message was returned. Mr. John Zant was at home, and would be happy to see him. 4. Mr. Rayburn was shown into one of the private sitting-rooms of the hotel. He observed that the customary position of the furniture in a room had been in some respects altered. An armchair, a side table, and a footstool had all been removed to one of the windows, and had been placed as close as possible to the light. On the table lay a large open roll of Morocco leather, containing rows of elegant little instruments in steel and ivory. Waiting by the table stood Mr. John Zant. He said, "Good morning," in a bass voice so profound and so melodious that those two commonplace words assumed a new importance coming from his lips. His personal appearance was in harmony with his magnificent voice. He was a tall, finely made man of dark complexion, with big, brilliant black eyes and a noble curling beard which hid the whole lower part of his face. Having bowed with a happy mingling of dignity and politeness, the conventional side of this gentleman's character suddenly vanished, and a crazy side to all appearance took its place. He dropped on his knees in front of the footstool. Had he forgotten to say his prayers that morning, and was he in such a hurry to remedy the fault that he had no time to spare for consulting appearances? The doubt had hardly suggested itself before it was set at rest in a most unexpected manner. Mr. Zant looked at his visitor with a bland smile and said, "Please let me see your feet." For the moment, Mr. Raeburn lost his presence of mind. He looked at the instruments on the side table. "Are you a corn cutter?" was all he could say. "Excuse me, sir," returned the polite operator. "The term you use is quite obsolete in our profession." He rose from his knees and added modestly, "I am a chiropodist." I beg your pardon." "Don't mention it. You are not, I imagine, in want of my professional services. To what motive may I attribute the honour of your visit?" By this time Mr. Raeburn had recovered himself. "I have come here," he answered, "under circumstances which require apology as well as explanation." Mr. Zant's highly polished manner betrayed signs of alarm. His suspicions pointed to a formidable conclusion, a conclusion that shook him to the innermost recesses of the pocket in which he kept his money. "The numerous demands on me," he began. Mr. Raeburn smiled. "Make your mind easy," he replied. "I don't want money. My object is to speak with you on the subject of a lady who is a relation of yours." "My sister-in-law!" Mr. Zant exclaimed. "Pray take a seat." Doubting if he had chosen a convenient time for his visit, Mr. Raeburn hesitated. "Am I likely to be in the way of persons who wish to consult you?" he asked. "Certainly not. My morning hours of attendance on my clients are from 11 to 1. The clock on the mantelpiece struck the 1:15 as he spoke. "I hope you don't bring me bad news," he said, very earnestly. "When I called on Mrs. Zant this morning, I heard that she had gone out for a walk. Is it indiscreet to ask how you became acquainted with her?" Mr. Raeburn at once mentioned what he had seen and heard in Kensington Gardens, not forgetting to add a few words which described his interview afterwards with Mrs. Zant. The lady's brother-in-law listened with an interest and sympathy which offered the strongest possible contrast to the unprovoked rudeness of the mistress of the lodging-house. He declared that he could only do justice to his sense of obligation by following Mr. Raeburn's example and expressing himself as frankly as if he had been speaking to an old friend. "The sad story of my sister-in-law's life," he said, "will, I think, explain certain things which must have naturally perplexed you. My brother was introduced to her at the house of an Australian gentleman on a visit to England. She was then employed as governess to his daughters. So sincere was the regard felt for her by the family that the parents had, at the entreaty of their children, asked her to accompany them when they returned to the colony. The governess thankfully accepted the proposal. "Had she no relations in England?" Mr. Raeburn asked. "She was literally all alone in the world, sir. When I tell you that she had been brought up in the Foundling Hospital, you will understand what I mean. Oh, there's no romance in my sister-in-law's story. She never has known or will know who her parents were, or why they deserted her. The happiest moment in her life was the moment when she and my brother first met. It was an instance on both sides of love at first sight. Though not a rich man, my brother had earned a sufficient income in mercantile pursuits. His character spoke for itself. In a word, he altered all the poor girl's prospects, as we then hoped and believed, for the better. Her employers deferred their return to Australia so that she might be married from their house. After a happy life of a few weeks only—" His voice failed him. He paused and turned his face from the light. "Pardon me," he said. "I'm not able even yet to speak composedly of my brother's death. Let me only say that the poor young wife was a widow before the happy days of the honeymoon were over. That dreadful calamity struck her down. Before my brother had been committed to the grave, her life was in danger from brain fever." Those words placed in a new light Mr. Raeburn's first fear that her intellect might be deranged. Looking at him attentively, Mr. Zant seemed to understand what was passing in the mind of his guest. "No," he said. "If the opinions of the medical men are to be trusted, the result of the illness is injury to her physical strength, not injury to her mind. I have observed in her, no doubt, a certain waywardness of temper since her illness, but that is a trifle. As an example of what I mean, I may tell you that I invited her, on her recovery, to pay me a visit. My house is not in London. The air doesn't agree with me. My place of residence is at St. Salins-on-Sea. I am not myself a married man, but my excellent housekeeper would have received Mrs. Zant with the utmost kindness. She was resolved, obstinately resolved, poor thing, to remain in London. It is needless to say that in her melancholy disposition I am attentive to her slightest wishes. I took a lodging for her, and at her special request I chose a house which was near Kensington Gardens. Is there any association with the gardens which led Mrs. Zant to make that request? Some association, I believe, with the memory of her husband. By the way, I wish to be sure of finding her at home when I call tomorrow. Did you say, in the course of your interesting statement, that she intended, as you supposed, to return to Kensington Gardens tomorrow, or has my memory deceived me? Your memory is perfectly accurate. Thank you. I confess I am not only distressed by what you have told me of Mrs. Zant, I am at a loss to know how to act for the best. My only idea at present is to try change of air and scene. What do you think yourself? I think you're right. Mr. Zant still hesitated. It would not be easy for me just now, he said, to leave my patients and take her abroad. The obvious reply to this occurred to Mr. Raeburn. A man of larger worldly experience might have felt certain suspicions, and might have remained silent. Mr. Raeburn spoke. "Why not renew your invitation and take her to your house at the seaside?" he said. In the perplexed state of Mr. Zant's mind, this plain course of action had apparently failed to present itself. His gloomy face brightened directly. "The very thing," he said. "I'll certainly take your advice. If the air of St. Salins does nothing else, it will improve her health and help her to recover her good looks. Did she strike you as having been, in happier times, a pretty woman?" This was a strangely familiar question to ask, almost an indelicate question under the circumstances. A certain furtive expression in Mr. Zant's fine eyes seemed to imply that it had been put with a purpose. Was it possible that he suspected Mr. Raeburn's interest in his sister-in-law to be inspired by any motive which was not perfectly unselfish and perfectly pure? To arrive at such a conclusion as this might be to judge hastily and cruelly of a man who was perhaps only guilty of a want of delicacy of feeling. Mr. Raeburn honestly did his best to assume the charitable point of view. At the same time, it is not to be denied that his words when he answered were carefully guarded, and that he rose to take his leave. Mr. John Zant hospitably protested. "Why are you in such a hurry? Must you really go? I shall have the honour of returning your visit tomorrow, when I have made arrangements to profit by that excellent suggestion of yours. Good-bye. God bless you." He held out his hand, a hand with a smooth surface and a tawny colour that fervently squeezed the fingers of a departing friend. "Is that man a scoundrel?" was Mr. Raeburn's first thought, after he had left the hotel. His moral sense set all hesitation at rest, and answered, "You're a fool if you doubt it." 5. Disturbed by presentiments, Mr. Raeburn returned to his house on foot, by way of trying what exercise would do towards composing his mind. The experiment failed. He went upstairs and played with Lucy. He drank an extra glass of wine at dinner. He took the child and her governess to a circus in the evening. He ate a little supper, fortified by another glass of wine, before he went to bed. And still those vague forebodings of evil persisted in torturing him. Looking back through his past life, he asked himself if any woman, his late wife of course excepted, had ever taken the predominant place in his thoughts which Mrs. Zant had assumed, without any discernible reason to account for it. If he had ventured to answer his own question, the reply would have been never. All the next day he waited at home in expectation of Mr. John Zant's promised visit, and waited in vain. Towards evening the parlour-maid appeared at the family tea-table, and presented to her master an unusually large envelope sealed with black wax and addressed in a strange handwriting. The absence of a stamp and postmark showed that it had been left at the house by a messenger. "Who brought this?" Mr. Raeburn asked. "A lady, sir, in deep mourning." "Did she leave any message?" "No, sir." Having drawn the inevitable conclusion, Mr. Raeburn shut himself up in his library. He was afraid of Lucy's curiosity and Lucy's questions if he read Mrs. Zant's letter in his daughter's presence. Looking at the open envelope after he had taken out the leaves of writing which it contained, he noticed these lines traced inside the cover. "My one excuse for troubling you, when I might have consulted my brother-in-law, will be found in the pages which I enclose. To speak plainly, you have been led to fear that I am not in my right senses. For this very reason I now appeal to you. Your dreadful doubt of me, sir, is my doubt too. Read what I have written about myself, and then tell me, I entreat you, which I am. A person who has been the object of a supernatural revelation, or an unfortunate creature who was only fit for imprisonment in a madhouse." Mr. Raeburn opened the manuscript. With steady attention, which soon quickened to breathless interest, he read what follows. 6. The lady's manuscript. "Yesterday morning the sun shone in a clear blue sky, after a succession of cloudy days, counting from the first day of the month. The radiant light had its animated effect on my poor spirits. I had passed the night more peacefully than usual, undisturbed by the dream, so cruelly familiar to me, that my lost husband is still living, the dream from which I always wake in tears. Never since the dark days of my sorrow have I been so little troubled by the self-tormenting fancies and fears which beset miserable women as when I left the house, and turned my steps towards Kensington Gardens, for the first time since my husband's death. Attended by my only companion, the little dog who had been his favourite as well as mine, I went to the quiet corner of the gardens which is nearest to Kensington. On that soft grass, under the shade of those grand trees, we had loitered together in the days of our betrothal. It was his favourite walk, and he had taken me to see it in the early days of our acquaintance. There he had first asked me to be his wife. There we had felt the rapture of our first kiss. It was surely natural that I should wish to see once more a place sacred to such memories as these. I am only 23 years old. I have no child to comfort me, no companion of my own age, nothing to love but the dumb creature who is so faithfully fond of me. I went to the tree under which we stood, when my dear one's eyes told his love before he could utter it in words. The sun of that vanished day shone on me again. It was the same noontide hour, the same solitude was around me. I had feared the first effect of the dreadful contrast between past and present. No, I was quiet and resigned. My thoughts, rising higher than earth, dwelt on the better life beyond the grave. Some tears came into my eyes, but I was not unhappy. My memory of all that happened may be trusted, even in trifles which relate only to myself. I was not unhappy. The first object that I saw when my eyes were clear again was the dog. He crouched a few paces away from me, trembling pitiably, but uttering no cry. What had caused the fear that overpowered him? I was soon to know. I called to the dog. He remained immovable, conscious of some mysterious coming thing that held him spellbound. I tried to go to the poor creature and fondle and comfort him. At the first step forward that I took, something stopped me. It was not to be seen, and not to be heard. It stopped me. The still figure of the dog disappeared from my view. The lonely scene round me disappeared, excepting the light from heaven, the tree that sheltered me, and the grass in front of me. A sense of unutterable expectation kept my eyes riveted on the grass. Suddenly I saw its myriad blades rise erect and shivering. The fear came to me of something passing over them with the invisible swiftness of the wind. The shivering advanced. It was all around me. It crept into the leaves of the tree over my head. They shuddered without a sound to tell of their agitation. Their pleasant natural rustling was struck dumb. The song of the birds had ceased. The cries of the waterfowl on the pond were heard no more. There was a dreadful silence. But the lovely sunshine poured down on me brightly as before. In that dazzling light, in that fearful silence, I felt an invisible presence near me. It touched me gently. At the touch my heart throbbed with an overwhelming joy. Exquisite pleasure thrilled through every nerve in my body. I knew him. From the unseen world, himself unseen, he had returned to me. Oh, I knew him. And yet my helpless mortality longed for a sign that might give me assurance of the truth. The yearning in me shaped itself into words. I tried to utter the words I would have said if I could have spoken. Oh, my angel, give me a token that it is you. But I was like a person struck dumb. I could only think it. The invisible presence read my thought. I felt my lips touched, as my husband's lips used to touch them when he kissed me. And that was my answer. A thought came to me again. I would have said, if I could have spoken, "Are you here to take me to the better world?" I waited. Nothing that I could feel touched me. I was conscious of thinking once more. I would have said, if I could have spoken, "Are you here to protect me?" I felt myself held in a gentle embrace as my husband's arms used to hold me when he pressed me to his breast, and that was my answer. The touch that was like the touch of his lips lingered and was lost. The clasp that was like the clasp of his hands pressed me and fell away. The garden scene resumed its natural aspect. I saw a human creature near, a lovely little girl looking at me. At that moment, when I was my own lonely self again, the sight of the child soothed and attracted me. I advanced, intending to speak to her. To my horror, I suddenly ceased to see her. She disappeared as if I had been stricken blind. And yet I could see the landscape round me. I could see the heaven above me. A time passed, only a few minutes, as I thought, and the child became visible to me again, walking hand in hand with her father. I approached them. I was close enough to see that they were looking at me with pity and surprise. My impulse was to ask if they saw anything strange in my face or my manner. Before I could speak, the horrible wonder happened again. They vanished from my view. Was the invisible presence still near me? Was it passing between me and my fellow mortals, forbidding communication in that place and at that time? It must have been so. When I turned away in my ignorance with a heavy heart, the dreadful blankness which had twice shut out from me the beings of my own race was not between me and my dog. The poor little creature filled me with pity. I called him to me. He moved at the sound of my voice and followed me languidly, not quite awakened yet from the trance of terror that had possessed him. Before I had retired by more than a few steps, I thought I was conscious of the presence again. I held out my longing arms to it. I waited in the hope of a touch to tell me that I might return. Perhaps I was answered by indirect means. I only know that a resolution to return to the same place at the same hour came to me and quieted my mind. The morning of the next day was dull and cloudy, but the rain held off. I set forth again to the gardens. My dog ran on before me into the street and stopped, waiting to see in which direction I might lead the way. When I turned towards the gardens, he dropped behind me. In a little while I looked back. He was following me no longer. He stood irresolute. I called to him. He advanced a few steps, hesitated, and ran back to the house. I went on by myself. Shall I confess my superstition? I thought the dog's desertion of me a bad omen. Arrived at the tree, I placed myself under it. The minutes followed each other uneventfully. The cloudy sky darkened. The dull surface of the grass showed no shuddering consciousness of an unearthly creature passing over it. I still waited, with an obstinacy which was fast becoming the obstinacy of despair. How long an interval elapsed while I kept watch on the ground before me, I am not able to say. I only know that a change came. Under the dull grey light, I saw the grass move, but not as it had moved on the day before. It shrivelled as if a flame had scorched it. No flame appeared. The brown underlying earth showed itself winding onward in a thin strip, which might have been a footpath traced in fire. It frightened me.
I longed for the protection of the invisible presence. I prayed for a warning of it, if danger was near. A touch answered me. It was as if a hand unseen had taken my hand, had raised it little by little, had left it pointing to the thin brown path that wound towards me under the shriveled blades of grass. I looked to the far end of the path. The unseen hand closed on my hand with a warning pressure. The revelation of the coming danger was near me. I waited for it. I saw it. The figure of a man appeared, advancing towards me along the thin brown path. I looked in his face as he came nearer. It showed me dimly the face of my husband's brother, John Zant. The consciousness of myself as a living creature left me. I knew nothing. I felt nothing. I was dead. When the torture of revival made me open my eyes, I found myself on the grass. Gentle hands raised my head at the moment when I recovered my senses. Who had brought me to life again? Who was taking care of me? I looked upwards and saw, bending over me, John Zant. 7. There the manuscript ended. Some lines had been added on the last page, but they had been so carefully erased as to be illegible. These words of explanation appeared below the cancelled sentences. I had begun to write the little that remains to be told when it struck me that I might, unintentionally, be exercising an unfair influence on your opinion. Let me only remind you that I believe absolutely in the supernatural revelation which I have endeavoured to describe. Remember this, and decide for me what I dare not decide for myself. There was no serious obstacle in the way of compliance with this request. Judged from the point of view of the materialist, Mrs. Zant might no doubt be the victim of illusions produced by a diseased state of the nervous system, which have been known to exist, as in the celebrated case of the bookseller Nicolai of Berlin, without being accompanied by derangement of the intellectual powers. But Mr. Raeburn was not asked to solve any such intricate problem as this. He had been merely instructed to read the manuscript and to say what impression it had left on him of the mental condition of the writer, whose doubt of herself had been in all probability first suggested by remembrance of the illness from which she had suffered, brain fever. Under these circumstances there could be little difficulty in forming an opinion. The memory which had recalled, and the judgment which had arranged, the succession of events related in the narrative, revealed a mind in full possession of its resources. Having satisfied himself so far, Mr. Raeburn abstained from considering the more serious question suggested by what he had read. At any time his habits of life and his ways of thinking would have rendered him unfit to weigh the arguments which assert or deny supernatural revelation among the creatures of earth. But his mind was now so disturbed by the startling record of experience which he had just read that he was only conscious of feeling certain impressions without possessing the capacity to reflect on them. That his anxiety on Mrs. Zant's account had been increased, and that his doubts of Mr. John Zant had been encouraged, were the only practical results of the confidence placed in him, of which he was thus far aware. In the ordinary exigencies of life, a man of hesitating disposition, his interest in Mrs. Zant's welfare, and his desire to discover what had passed between her brother-in-law and herself after their meeting in the gardens, urged him to instant action. In half an hour more he had arrived at her lodgings. He was at once admitted. 8. Mrs. Zant was alone in an imperfectly lit room. "I hope you'll excuse the bad light," she said. "My head's been burning as if the fever had come back again. Oh, don't go away. After what I have suffered, you don't know how dreadful it is to be alone." The tone of her voice told him that she had been crying. He at once tried the best means of setting the poor lady at ease by telling her of the conclusion at which he had arrived after reading her manuscript. The happy result showed itself instantly. Her face brightened, her manner changed, she was eager to hear more. "Have I produced any other impression on you?" she asked. He understood the allusion. Expressing sincere respect for her own convictions, he told her honestly that he was not prepared to enter on the obscure and terrible question of supernatural interposition. Grateful for the tone which he had answered her, she wisely and delicately changed the subject. "I must speak to you of my brother-in-law," she said. "He has told me of your visit, and I am anxious to know what you think of him. Do you like Mr. John Zant?" Mr. Raeburn hesitated. The careworn look appeared again in her face. "If you had felt as kindly towards him as he feels towards you," she said, "I might have gone to St. Salins with a lighter heart." Mr. Raeburn thought of the supernatural appearances described at the close of her narrative. "You believe in that terrible warning," he remonstrated, "and yet you go to your brother-in-law's house." "I believe," she answered, "in the spirit of the man who loved me in the days of his earthly bondage. I am under his protection. What have I to do but to cast away my fears and to wait in faith and hope? It might have helped my resolution if a friend had been near to encourage me." She paused and smiled sadly. "I must remember," she resumed, "that your way of understanding my position is not my way. I ought to have told you that Mr. John Zant feels needless anxiety about my health. He declares that he will not lose sight of me until his mind is at ease. It is useless to attempt to alter his opinion. He says my nerves are shattered, and who that sees me can doubt it? He tells me that my only chance of getting better is to try change of air and perfect repose. How can I contradict him? He reminds me that I have no relation but himself, and no house open to me but his own, and God knows he is right." She said those last words in accents of melancholy resignation, which grieved the good man whose one merciful purpose was to serve and console her. He spoke impulsively with the freedom of an old friend. "I want to know more of you and Mr. John Zant than I know now," he said. "My motive is a better one than mere curiosity. Do you believe that I feel a sincere interest in you?" "With my whole heart." That reply encouraged him to proceed with what he had to say. "When you recovered from your fainting fit," he began, "Mr. John Zant asked questions, of course. He asked what could possibly have happened in such a quiet place as Kensington Gardens to make me faint." "And how did you answer?" "Answer? I couldn't even look at him." "You said nothing?" "Nothing. I don't know what he thought of me. He might have been surprised, or he might have been offended." "Is he easily offended?" Mr. Raeburn asked. "Not in my experience of him." "Do you mean your experience of him before your illness?" "Yes. Since my recovery, his engagements with country patients have kept him away from London. I haven't seen him since he took those lodgings for me. But he's always considerate. He has written more than once to beg that I will not think him neglectful, and to tell me, what I knew already through my poor husband, that he has no money of his own and must live by his profession." "And in your husband's lifetime, were the two brothers on good terms?" "Always. The one complaint I ever heard my husband make of John Zant was that he didn't come to see us often enough after our marriage. Is there some wickedness in him which we have never suspected? It may be, but how can it be? I have every reason to be grateful to the man against whom I have been supernaturally warned. His conduct to me has always been perfect. I can't tell you what I owe to his influence in quieting my mind when a dreadful doubt arose about my husband's death." "Do you mean doubts if he died a natural death?" "Oh, no, no. He was dying of rapid consumption, but his sudden death took the doctors by surprise. One of them thought that he might have taken an overdose of his sleeping drops by mistake. The other disputed this conclusion, or there might have been an inquest in the house. Oh, don't speak of it any more. Let us talk of something else. Tell me when I shall see you again." "I hardly know. When do you and your brother-in-law leave London?" "Tomorrow." She looked at Mr. Raeburn with a piteous entreaty in her eyes. She said timidly, "Do you ever go to the seaside and take your dear little girl with you?" The request, at which she had only dared to hint, touched on the idea which was at that moment in Mr. Raeburn's mind. Interpreted by his strong prejudice against John Zant, what she had said of her brother-in-law filled him with forebodings of peril to herself, all the more powerful in their influence for this reason, that he shrank from distinctly realizing them. If another person had been present at the interview, and had said to him afterwards, "That man's reluctance to visit his sister-in-law while her husband was living is associated with the secret sense of guilt which her innocence cannot even imagine. He, and he alone, knows the cause of her husband's sudden death. His feigned anxiety about her health is adopted as the safest means of enticing her into his house." If those formidable conclusions had been urged on Mr. Raeburn, he would have felt it his duty to reject them as unjustifiable aspersions on an absent man. And yet, when he took leave that evening of Mrs. Zant, he had pledged himself to give Lucy a holiday at the seaside, and he had said without blushing that the child really deserved it as a reward for general good conduct and attention to her lessons. 9. 3 days later, the father and daughter arrived towards evening at St. Salins-on-Sea. They found Mrs. Zant at the station. The poor woman's joy on seeing them expressed itself like the joy of a child. "Oh, I'm so glad," was all she could say when they met. Lucy was half smothered with kisses, and was made supremely happy by a present of the finest doll she had ever possessed. Mrs. Zant accompanied her friends to the rooms which had been secured at the hotel. She was able to speak confidentially to Mr. Raeburn while Lucy was in the balcony hugging her doll and looking at the sea. The one event that had happened during Mrs. Zant's short residence at St. Salins was the departure of her brother-in-law that morning for London. He had been called away to operate on the feet of a wealthy patient who knew the value of his time. His housekeeper expected that he would return to dinner. As to his conduct towards Mrs. Zant, he was not only as attentive as ever, he was almost oppressively affectionate in his language and manner. There was no service that a man could render which he had not eagerly offered to her. He declared that he had already perceived an improvement in her health. He congratulated her on having decided to stay in his house, and, as a proof perhaps of his sincerity, he had repeatedly pressed her hand. "Have you any idea what all this means?" she said simply. Mr. Raeburn kept his idea to himself. He professed ignorance and asked next what sort of person the housekeeper was. Mrs. Zant shook her head ominously. "Such a strange creature," she said, "and in the habit of taking such liberties that I begin to be afraid she is a little crazy." "Is she an old woman?" "No, only middle-aged. This morning, after her master had left the house, she actually asked me what I thought of my brother-in-law. I told her, as coldly as possible, that I thought he was very kind. She was quite insensible to the tone in which I had spoken. She went on from bad to worse. "Do you call him the sort of man who would take the fancy of a young woman?" was her next question. She actually looked at me. I might have been wrong, and I hope I was, as if the young woman she had in mind was myself. I said, "I don't think of such things, and I don't talk about them." Still, she was not in the least discouraged. She made a personal remark next. "Excuse me, but you do look wretchedly pale." I thought she seemed to enjoy the defect in my complexion. I really believe it raised me in her estimation. "We shall get on better in time," she said. "I'm beginning to like you." She walked out humming a tune. "Don't you agree with me? Don't you think she's crazy?" "I can hardly give an opinion until I've seen her. Does she look as if she might have been a pretty woman at one time of her life?" "Not the sort of pretty woman whom I admire." Mr. Raeburn smiled. "I was thinking," he resumed, "that this person's odd conduct might perhaps be accounted for. She is probably jealous of any young lady who is invited to her master's house, and, till she noticed your complexion, she began to be jealous of you." Innocently at a loss to understand how she could become an object of the housekeeper's jealousy, Mrs. Zant looked at Mr. Raeburn in astonishment. Before she could give expression to her feeling of surprise, there was an interruption, a welcome interruption. A waiter entered the room and announced a visitor described as a gentleman. Mrs. Zant rose at once to retire. "Who is the gentleman?" Mr. Raeburn asked, detaining Mrs. Zant as he spoke. A voice which they both recognized answered gaily from the outer side of the door. A friend from London. 10. "Welcome to St. Salins," cried Mr. John Zant. "I knew that you were expected, my dear sir, and I took my chance at finding you at the hotel." He turned to his sister-in-law and kissed her hand with an elaborate gallantry worthy of Sir Charles Grandison himself. "When I reached home, my dear, and heard that you had gone out, I guessed that your object was to receive our excellent friend. You have not felt lonely while I have been away?" "That's right, that's right." He looked toward the balcony and discovered Lucy at the open window, staring at the magnificent stranger. "Your little daughter, Mr. Raeburn. Dear child! Come and kiss me." Lucy answered in one positive word. "No." Mr. John Zant was not easily discouraged. "Show me your doll, darling," he said. "Sit on my knee." Lucy answered in two positive words. "I won't." Her father approached the window to administer the necessary reproof. Mr. John Zant interfered in the cause of mercy with the best grace. He held up his hands in cordial entreaty. "Dear Mr. Raeburn, the fairies are sometimes shy, and this little fairy doesn't take to strangers at first sight. Dear child, all in good time. And what stay do you make at St. Salins? May we hope that our poor attractions will tempt you to prolong your visit?" He put his flattering little question with an ease of manner which was rather too plainly assumed, and he looked at Mr. Raeburn with a watchfulness which appeared to attach undue importance to the reply. When he said, "What stay do you make at St. Salins?" did he really mean, "How soon do you leave us?" Inclining to adopt this conclusion, Mr. Raeburn answered cautiously that his stay at the seaside would depend on circumstances. Mr. John Zant looked at his sister-in-law, sitting silent in a corner with Lucy on her lap. "Exert your attractions," he said. "Make the circumstances agreeable to our good friend. Will you dine with us today, my dear sir, and bring your little fairy with you?" Lucy was far from receiving this complimentary allusion in the spirit in which it had been offered. "I'm not a fairy," she declared. "I'm a child." "And a naughty child," her father added, with all the severity that he could assume. "I can't help it, Papa. The man with the big beard puts me out." The man with the big beard was amused, amiably, paternally amused by Lucy's plain speaking. He repeated his invitation to dinner, and he did his best to look disappointed when Mr. Raeburn made the necessary excuses. "Another day," he said, without, however, fixing the day. "I think you'll find my house comfortable. My housekeeper may perhaps be eccentric, but in all essentials a woman in 1,000. Do you feel the change from London already? Our air at St. Salins is really worthy of its reputation. Invalids who come here are cured as if by magic. What do you think of Mrs. Zant? How does she look?" Mr. Raeburn was evidently expected to say that she looked better. He said it. Mr. John Zant seemed to have anticipated a stronger expression of opinion. "Surprisingly better," he pronounced. "Infinitely better. We ought both to be grateful. Pray believe that we are grateful." "If you mean grateful to me," Mr. Raeburn remarked, "I don't quite understand." "You don't quite understand? Is it possible that you have forgotten our conversation when I first had the honour of receiving you? Look at Mrs. Zant again." Mr. Raeburn looked, and Mrs. Zant's brother-in-law explained himself. "You notice the return of her colour, the healthy brightness of her eyes." "No, my dear, I'm not paying you idle compliments. I'm stating plain facts. For that happy result, Mr. Raeburn, we are indebted to you." "Surely not." "Surely, yes. It was at your valuable suggestion that I thought of inviting my sister-in-law to visit me at St. Salins." "Ah, you remember it now. Forgive me if I look at my watch. The dinner hour is on my mind. Not, as your dear little daughter there seems to think, because I am greedy, but because I am always punctual, in justice to the cook. Shall we see you tomorrow? Call early, and you'll find us at home." He gave Mrs. Zant his arm, and bowed and smiled and kissed his hand to Lucy, and left the room. Recalling their interview at the hotel in London, Mr. Raeburn now understood John Zant's object on that occasion in assuming the character of a helpless man in need of a sensible suggestion. If Mrs. Zant's residence under his roof became associated with evil consequences, he could declare that she would never have entered the house but for Mr. Rayburn's advice. With the next day came the hateful necessity of returning this man's visit. Mr. Rayburn was placed between two alternatives. In Mrs. Zant's interest he must remain, no matter at what sacrifice of his own inclinations, on good terms with her brother-in-law, or he must return to London and leave the poor woman to her fate. His choice, it is needless to say, was never a matter of doubt. He called at the house, and did his innocent best, without in the least deceiving Mr. John Zant, to make himself agreeable during the short duration of his visit. Descending the stairs on his way out, accompanied by Mrs. Zant, he was surprised to see a middle-aged woman in the hall who looked as if she was waiting there expressly to attract notice. "The housekeeper," Mrs. Zant whispered. "She is impudent enough to try to make acquaintance with you." This was exactly what the housekeeper was waiting in the hall to do. "I hope you like our watering place, sir," she began. "If I can be of any service to you, pray command me. Any friend of this lady's has a claim on me, and you are an old friend, no doubt." "I'm only the housekeeper, but I presume to take a sincere interest in Mrs. Zant, and I'm indeed glad to see you here. We none of us know, do we, how soon we may want a friend? No offence, I hope." "Thank you, sir. Good morning." There was nothing in the woman's eyes which indicated an unsettled mind, nothing in the appearance of her lips which suggested habits of intoxication. That her strange outburst of familiarity proceeded from some strong motive seemed to be more than probable. Putting together what Mrs. Zant had already told him and what he had himself observed, Mr. Rayburn suspected that the motive might be found in the housekeeper's jealousy of her master. 11. Reflecting in the solitude of his own room, Mr. Rayburn felt that the one prudent course to take would be to persuade Mrs. Zant to leave St. Salins. He tried to prepare her for this strong proceeding when she came the next day to take Lucy out for a walk. "If you still regret having forced yourself to accept your brother-in-law's invitation," was all he ventured to say, "don't forget that you are perfect mistress of your own actions. You have only to come to me at the hotel, and I'll take you back to London by the next train." She positively refused to entertain the idea. "I should be a thankless creature indeed," she said, "if I accepted your proposal. Do you think I'm ungrateful enough to involve you in a personal quarrel with John Zant? No. If I find myself forced to leave the house, I'll go away alone." There was no moving her from this resolution. When she and Lucy had gone out together, Mr. Rayburn remained at the hotel with a mind ill at ease. A man of readier mental resources might have felt at a loss how to act for the best in the emergency that now confronted him. While he was still as far as ever from arriving at a decision, some person knocked at the door. Had Mrs. Zant returned? He looked up as the door was opened, and saw, to his astonishment, Mr. John Zant's housekeeper. "Don't let me alarm you, sir," the woman said. "Mrs. Zant has been taking a little faint at the door of our house. My master's attending to her." "Where's the child?" Mr. Rayburn asked. "I was bringing her back to you, sir, when we met a lady and a little girl at the door of the hotel. They were on their way to the beach, and Miss Lucy begged hard to be allowed to go with them. The lady said the two children were playfellows, and she was sure you wouldn't object." "The lady's quite right. Mrs. Zant's illness is not serious, I hope?" "I think not, sir, but I should like to say something in her interests. May I?" "Thank you." She advanced a step nearer to him and spoke her next words in a whisper. "Take Mrs. Zant away from this place, and lose no time in doing it." Mr. Rayburn was on his guard. He merely asked, "Why?" The housekeeper answered in a curiously indirect manner, partly in jest as it seemed, and partly in earnest. "When a man's lost his wife," she said, "there's some difference of opinion in Parliament, as I hear, whether he does right or wrong if he marries his wife's sister. Wait a bit, I'm coming to the point. My master is one who has a long head on his shoulders. He sees consequences which escape the notice of people like me. In his way of thinking, if one man may marry his wife's sister and no harm done, where's the objection if another man pays a compliment to the family and marries his brother's widow? My master, if you please, is that other man. Take the widow away before she marries him." This was beyond endurance. "You insult Mrs. Zant," Mr. Rayburn answered, "if you suppose that such a thing is possible." "Oh, insult her, do I? Listen to me. One of three things will happen. She'll be entrapped into consenting to it, or frightened into consenting to it, or drugged into consenting to it. Mr. Raeburn was too indignant to let her go on. "You're talking nonsense," he said. "There can be no marriage. The law forbids it." "Are you one of the people who see no farther than their noses?" she asked insolently. "Won't the law take his money? Is he obliged to mention that he is related to her by marriage when he buys the licence?" She paused. Her humour changed. She stamped furiously on the floor. The true motive that animated her showed herself in her next words, and warned Mr. Raeburn to grant a more favourable hearing than he had accorded to her yet. "If you won't stop it," she burst out, "I will. If he marries anybody, he's bound to marry me. Will you take her away? I ask you for the last time. Will you take her away?" The tone in which she made that final appeal to him had its effect. "I'll go back with you to John Zant's house," he said, "and judge for myself." She laid her hand on his arm. "I must go first, or you may not be let in. Follow me in 5 minutes, and don't knock at the street door." On the point of leaving him, she abruptly returned. "We've forgotten something," she said. "Suppose my master refuses to see you. His temper might get the better of him. He might make it so unpleasant for you that you would be obliged to go." "My temper might get the better of me," Mr. Raeburn replied, "and if I thought it was in Mrs. Zant's interests, I might refuse to leave the house unless she accompanied me." "That will never do, sir." "Why not?" "Because I should be the person to suffer." "In what way?" "In this way. If you picked a quarrel with my master, I should be blamed for it because I showed you upstairs. Besides, think of the lady. You must frighten her out of her senses if it came to a struggle between you two men." The language was exaggerated, but there was a force in this last objection which Mr. Raeburn was obliged to acknowledge. "And, after all," the housekeeper continued, "he has more right over her than you have. He's related to her, and you are only her friend." Mr. Raeburn declined to let himself be influenced by this consideration. "Mr. John Zant is only related to her by marriage," he said. "If she prefers trusting in me, come what may of it, I will be worthy of her confidence." The housekeeper shook her head. "That only means another quarrel," she answered. "The wise way, with a man like my master, is the peaceable way. We must manage to deceive him. I don't like deceit. In that case, sir, I wish you good-bye. We will leave Mrs. Zant to do the best she can for herself." Mr. Raeburn was unreasonable. He positively refused to adopt this alternative. "Will you hear what I've got to say?" the housekeeper asked. "There can be no harm in that," he admitted. "Go on." She took him at his word. "When you called at our house," she began, "did you notice the doors in the passage on the first floor?" "Very well. One of them is the door to the drawing-room, and the other is the door of the library. Do you remember the drawing-room, sir?" "I thought it a large, well-lit room," Mr. Raeburn answered, "and I noticed a doorway in the wall with a handsome curtain hanging over it." "That's enough for our purpose," the housekeeper resumed. "On the other side of the curtain, if you'd looked in, you would have found the library. Suppose my master is as polite as usual and begs to be excused for not receiving you because it's an inconvenient time, and suppose you are polite on your side and take yourself off by the drawing-room door. You find me waiting downstairs on the first landing. Do you see it now?" "I can't say I do." "You surprise me, sir. What is to prevent us from getting back softly into the library by the door in the passage? And why shouldn't we use that second way into the library as a means of discovering what may be going on in the drawing-room? Safe behind the curtain, you'll see him if he behaves uncivilly to Mrs. Zant, or you'll hear if she calls for help. In either case, you may be as rough and ready with my master as you find needful. It will be he who has frightened her, and not you. And who can blame the poor housekeeper because Mr. Raeburn did his duty and protected a helpless woman? There's my plan, sir." "Is it worth trying?" he answered sharply enough. "I don't like it." The housekeeper opened the door again and wished him good-bye. If Mr. Raeburn had felt no more than an ordinary interest in Mrs. Zant, he would have let the woman go. As it was, he stopped her, and after some further protest, which proved to be useless, he ended in giving way. "You promise to follow my directions," she stipulated. He gave the promise. She smiled, nodded, and left him. True to his instructions, Mr. Raeburn reckoned 5 minutes by his watch before he followed her. 12. The housekeeper was waiting for him, with the street door ajar. "They're both in the drawing-room," she whispered, leading the way upstairs. "Step softly and take him by surprise." A table of oblong shape stood midway between the drawing-room walls. At the end of it, which was nearest the window, Mrs. Zant was pacing to and fro across the breadth of the room. At the opposite end of the table, John Zant was seated. Taken completely by surprise, he showed himself in his true character. He started to his feet and protested with an oath against the intrusion which had been committed on him. Heedless of his action and his language, Mr. Raeburn could look at nothing, could think of nothing but Mrs. Zant. She was still walking slowly to and fro, unconscious of the words of sympathy which he addressed to her, insensible even, as it seemed, to the presence of other persons in the room. John Zant's voice broke the silence. His temper was under control again. He had his reasons for still remaining on friendly terms with Mr. Raeburn. "I'm sorry, I forgot myself just now," he said. Mr. Raeburn's interest was concentrated on Mrs. Zant. He took no notice of the apology. "When did this happen?" he asked. "About a quarter of an hour ago. I was fortunately at home. Without speaking to me, without noticing me, she walked upstairs like a person in a dream." Mr. Raeburn suddenly pointed to Mrs. Zant. "Look at her," he said. "There's a change." All restlessness in her movements had come to an end. She was standing at the farther end of the table, which was nearest to the window, in the full flow of sunlight pouring at that moment over her face. Her eyes looked out straight before her, void of all expression. Her lips were a little parted. Her head drooped slightly towards her shoulder in an attitude which suggested listening for something, or waiting for something. In the warm, brilliant light, she stood before the two men, a living creature, self-isolated in a stillness like the stillness of death. John Zant was ready with the expression of his opinion. "A nervous seizure," he said. "Something resembling catalepsy, as you see." "Have you sent for a doctor?" "A doctor's not wanted." "I beg your pardon. It seems to me that medical help is absolutely necessary." "Be so good as to remember," Mr. John Zant answered, "that the decision rests with me as the lady's relative. I am sensible of the honour which your visit confers on me, but the time has been unhappily chosen. Forgive me if I suggest that you will do well to retire." Mr. Raeburn had not forgotten the housekeeper's advice, or the promise which she had exacted from him, but the expression in John Zant's face was a serious trial to his self-control. He hesitated and looked back at Mrs. Zant. If he provoked a quarrel by remaining in the room, the one alternative would be the removal of her by force. Fear of the consequences to herself if she was suddenly and roughly roused from her trance was the one consideration which reconciled him to submission. He withdrew. The housekeeper was waiting for him below, on the first landing. When the door of the drawing-room had been closed again, she signed to him to follow her, and returned up the stairs. After another struggle with himself, he obeyed. They entered the library from the corridor, and placed themselves behind the closed curtain which hung over the doorway. It was easy so to arrange the edge of the drapery as to observe, without exciting suspicion, whatever was going on in the next room. Mrs. Zant's brother-in-law was approaching her at the time when Mr. Raeburn saw him again. In the instant afterwards she moved, before he had completely passed over the space between them. Her still figure began to tremble. She lifted her drooping head. For a moment there was a shrinking in her, as if she had been touched by something. She seemed to recognize the touch. She was still again. John Zant watched the change. It suggested to him that she was beginning to recover her senses. He tried the experiment of speaking to her. "My love, my sweet angel, come to the heart that adores you." He advanced again. He passed into the flood of sunlight pouring over her. "Rouse yourself," he said. She still remained in the same position, apparently at his mercy, neither hearing him nor seeing him. "Rouse yourself," he repeated. My darling, come to me." At the instant when he attempted to embrace her, at the instant when Mr. Raeburn rushed into the room, John Zant's arms, suddenly turning rigid, remained outstretched. With a shriek of horror, he struggled to draw them back, struggled in the empty brightness of the sunshine, as if some invisible grip had seized him. "What has got me?" the wretch screamed. "Who is holding my hands? Oh, the cold of it! The cold of it!" His features became convulsed. His eyes turned upwards until only the white eyeballs were visible. He fell prostrate with a crash that shook the room. The housekeeper ran in. She knelt by her master's body. With one hand she loosened his cravat. With the other she pointed to the end of the table. Mrs. Zant still kept her place, but there was another change. Little by little her eyes recovered their natural living expression, then slowly closed. She tottered backwards from the table and lifted her hands wildly, as if to grasp at something which might support her. Mr. Raeburn hurried to her before she fell, lifted her in his arms, and carried her out of the room. One of the servants met them in the hall. He sent for a carriage. In a quarter of an hour more, Mrs. Zant was safe under his care at the hotel. 13. That night a note written by the housekeeper was delivered to Mrs. Zant. "The doctors give little hope. The paralytic stroke is spreading upwards to his face. If death spares him, he will live a helpless man. I shall take care of him to the last. As for you, forget him." Mrs. Zant gave the note to Mr. Raeburn. "Read it and destroy it," she said. "It is written in ignorance of the terrible truth." He obeyed and looked at her in silence, waiting to hear more. She hid her face. The few words she had addressed to him after a struggle with herself fell slowly and reluctantly from her lips. She said, "No mortal hand held the hands of John Zant. The guardian spirit was with me. The promised protection was with me. I know it. I wish to know no more." Having spoken, she rose to retire. He opened the door for her, seeing that she needed rest in her own room. Left by himself, he began to consider the prospect that was before him in the future. How was he to regard the woman who had just left him? As a poor creature weakened by disease, the victim of her own nervous delusion? Or as the chosen object of a supernatural revelation, unparalleled by any similar revelation that he had heard of or had found recorded in books? His first discovery of the place that she really held in his estimation dawned on his mind, when he felt himself recoiling from the conclusion which presented her to his pity, and yielding to the nobler conviction which felt with her faith and raised her to a place apart among other women. 14. They left St. Salins the next day. Arrived at the end of the journey, Lucy held fast by Mrs. Zant's hand. Tears were rising in the girl's eyes. "Are we to bid her good-bye?" she said sadly to her father. He seemed to be unwilling to trust himself to speak. He only said, "My dear, ask her yourself." But the result justified him, and Lucy was happy again. You might be one of those people like me who doesn't like the stories to be interrupted with ads. And this podcast has ads on it. However, there is a solution. If you would like access to the stories without ads and a link to a library of all the stories I've ever done that you can download without ads, you can get that by becoming a patron. So if you join for $5 or the equivalent in your currency a month, you can have all the stories ad-free. So consider becoming a patron. Go to patreon.com/Barcud, Barcud. That was Mrs. Zant and the Ghost by Wilkie Collins, and it was published in 1885. I need to apologise for the sound like a war zone in the background. It was bonfire night, that is to say, the anniversary of the gunpowder plot. So every 5th of November in the UK, we let off fireworks going back from 1605. So the gunpowder plot, just in case you didn't know, it occurred in 1605, and it was a failed assassination attempt by a group of English Catholics against King James of England, who was a Protestant king. I think he flirted with Catholicism. I may be wrong on that one. One of the Jameses did anyway. The conspirators, led by Robert Catesby, planned to blow up the House of Lords during the state opening of Parliament on November the 5th with the goal of assassinating King James and reinstating a Catholic monarch. The plot was discovered when one of the conspirators, Guy Fawkes, was caught guarding 36 barrels of gunpowder placed beneath the House of Lords. Fawkes was arrested, tortured, and executed. So it's called, we tend to call it, you call it Guy Fawkes Night, but bonfire night. Anyway, that was what was going on. I could have stopped and recorded another time, but I simply do not have the time in my schedule to wait. So that's the explanation. Let's go back to Mrs. Zant and the Ghost. Published in 1885, it was part of his collection, Collins's collection, Little Novels. And this was written during the latter part of Collins's career when he was suffering from poor health and his laudanum addiction was at its height. The story represents an interesting evolution in his supernatural fiction, moving away from the more sensational elements of his earlier works towards a more nuanced psychological approach. It's worth noting that this was published during a period when the ghost story genre was becoming increasingly sophisticated, with authors like Henry James, The Turn of the Screw, which was published in 1898, which is, 13 years later, beginning to blur the lines between the psychological and supernatural explanations, which is exactly what we get in this story. And at this time, the Victorians were very interested in spiritualism and psychic research. So 1885, a Victorian ghost story. Let me say something about Collins. So Wilkie Collins was born, William Wilkie Collins, on the 8th of January 1824 in London, and he emerged as one of Victorian England's most prominent novelists and playwrights, the son of a well-known landscape painter, William Collins. He enjoyed a privileged upbringing that included extensive travel throughout Europe, a bit like Ruskin, really. His early exposure to art and literature, coupled with his father's connections in London's cultural circles, helped shape his future literary career. Collins formed a particularly significant friendship with Charles Dickens in 1851, which would profoundly influence both writers' works and lead to numerous collaborative projects. They walked around England, they travelled a lot together. The Tour of the Two Lazy Apprentices. Despite suffering from chronic ill health, including what was likely rheumatic gout, Collins produced an impressive body of work that revolutionized the emerging genre of sensation fiction, which is an emergent from the Gothic, really. The Gothic was sensation fiction as well. His most celebrated novel is The Woman in White, 1859. So 20-odd years before, 23 years before, and The Moonstone, 1868, are considered masterpieces of Victorian literature and pivotal works in the development of the detective novel. Collins never married, but maintained two separate households with his long-term companions, Caroline Graves and Martha Rudd, by whom he had 3 children. His personal life, characterized by such unconventional arrangements, which is very interesting, looking at the very conventional setup of this story, reflected his progressive views on social issues, which often emerge in his writing through criticism of Victorian marriage laws and social hypocrisy. We've got it, haven't we? Wilkie Collins died on 23rd September 1889 at his home in 82 Wimpole Street, London, after suffering a paralytic stroke, just like this guy here, almost prophetic. The final years of his life were marked, Mr. Zant, the final years of his life were marked by increasingly deteriorating health, exacerbated by his long-term addiction to laudanum, which he had begun to take to combat the intense pain of his gout. Apparently gout is really, really painful. His dependence on the drug, which contains opium, was substantial enough that he was reportedly consuming quantities that would have been lethal to anyone without his acquired tolerance. That's what happens to heroin addicts, of course. Caroline Graves remained with him until the end. He was buried at Kensal Green Cemetery in London, notably against the Victorian convention of elaborate funerals. Collins had specifically requested a simple ceremony with no mourning clothes or excessive display. His estate was valued at £2,000, a relatively modest sum for a writer of his stature, suggesting that his lifestyle and medical expenses had consumed much of his earnings from his literary success. Let's go back to the story. So what's the deal, really? Now we've heard about his own views and his own life, which in a weird way has parallels with this story. So this was written 4 years before he died. What is the big deal? Why? See, so when I first read the story, I thought, well, there we are. It's John Zant. He seems a nice fella. He got on well with his brother. His brother's died. He wants to look after the widow. He finds her an attractive woman. Why not? Well, there are a couple of issues there. One is, to a modern sensibility, that she did not return the feelings. Now, of course, Collins highlights the vulnerability of a young widow with no money. This is a foundling. She has no money at all. She has been elevated to the middle classes by marriage, really, or but she hasn't any money to support that, and so she and clearly her husband wasn't able to provide for her in the short time that he had with her, and so she then in Victorian and in many cultures across the world now would fall to the generosity or beneficence of relatives. So far, so good. So it might be that many women who didn't love their new widows, who didn't love their new protectors, would enter into an otherwise amicable marriage, even though it wasn't a marriage of love. It was a marriage of convenience. And that's nothing to say that that couldn't be happy if the two people were aligned. So I thought, okay, well, she doesn't want him, and fair enough, and it's her choice, and fair enough, But why? Where's the outrage? Well, here's the outrage. The central tension arises from the Deceased Wife's Sister Marriage Act of 1835. So it's very interesting what we make laws about, and that reflects our society, doesn't it? I think we made a law last year to stop the consumption of NOS, which is nitrogen oxide, which is laughing gas, which it probably isn't good for you to take it, but it's not good to smoke or drink or eat cream cakes or sit around eating pizzas, is it? But we made it illegal. And it almost seemed to me to be, I don't think it's lethal. I don't think it's ever killed anybody. You can't become addicted to it, maybe psychologically, but not physically. It's far safer than alcohol or tobacco or I don't know about vapes, to be fair. But we made it, and then, we make these laws as a statement of, listen, when I worked for the NHS, I was in a position we had to draft a modern slavery declaration for the organisation. And basically that said we don't agree with it. And so what we did was we copied Sheffield NHS's and changed the names and put that out in our name. And then we had one. Now, it strikes me, did anybody ever think we were in favour of it? Did we actively, and did it, if we were inadvertently supporting policies that created the conditions of modern slavery, which I'm not sure we were, but say we were unbeknownst, would that declaration have changed anything? Or is it just an empty signal? Anyway, getting back to the deceased, but we have to then say, okay, it's an empty signal, but it signals what's important to us. Yeah, what's important to us as a society, what we think we should be saying morally. The Deceased Wife's Sister Marriage Act of 1835 prohibited a man from marrying his dead wife's sister. Now, I'm sitting going, why? But by extension, this law reflected Victorian unease about marriages between widows and their deceased husbands' brothers. Yeah, while such marriages were not explicitly illegal, they existed in a morally ambiguous space. The housekeeper, she says, well, there's some difference of opinion in Parliament, as I hear, whether he does right or wrong if he marries his wife's sister. This reference to contemporary parliamentary debate reveals the period's deep social anxiety about such unions. And I'm still like, oh, okay. But now I get the story, all right? So the text suggests that John Zant intends to exploit legal ambiguity. And he says, won't the law take his money? Is he obliged to mention that he's related to her by marriage when he buys the license? This is this kind of realm of things that aren't illegal, but the state gets itself interested in them. But it isn't going to know. In these days of mass surveillance, it would know, wouldn't it? It would know exactly everything about you when you bought that license, because you'd have to prove your identity. You'd have to take ID documents. I had to prove that I got a new SIM for my phone, and I had to confirm my identity. I'm like, what do you care who I am? Yeah, but they do, and this is it. So there we are. So this indicates premeditated deception, my notes say, rather than genuine affection. Well, I'm not sure. Why does he want to marry her anyway? There she is, and he's almost forgotten about her. I mean, she says herself that he didn't visit her for a long time. And then our man, Rayburn, comes along and goes, do you know what? Your sister-in-law is crackers. And he goes, my sister-in-law. And then after that, he decides, right, I think I'll marry her. But he hadn't, it's not like he was driven to it until it was like somebody put the idea in his head. Rayburn put the idea in his head. The other thing that struck me about was Rayburn's position. I read, what was that story? I read it for the detectives. And it was about this guy who, there's this widow, I think, again. No. She is married to a man who is a brute. And our man comes in and he is her protector. And the author is very clear that it's a pure interest he has in her. It's not it isn't that he wants her for himself. Oh no, it's pure. And of course, this is a big thing. And whether Collins is actually subtly poking fun at this, because at the end, I mean, clearly that's not the case, is it? It's the hypocrisy of Rayburn, who claims he's doing it because he's just a decent chap, and really it's because she's quite bonny. Yeah. So listen. As I've said many times before, you can't tell the heart to do anything. It does what it wants. So it could be that he fell in love with her. Fair enough. But then to pretend it's a pure, I'm just doing it because of, and then at the end we see the real truth. So is Rayburn any different? Because Mrs. Zant doesn't actually evince any love particularly strongly for Rayburn either. She sees him as a friend. And yet here he is. So he's pretty parallel to John Zant. So clearly the Victorians are getting exercised by something in this story that I'm not. I don't see a world of difference between John Zant and Mr. Rayburn. Partly, Mr. Rayburn appears to be a gentleman. He doesn't appear to have a profession unless I've misremembered. But and John Zant works cutting corns, which, it's a living. And a very worthwhile one. I mean, this is talk about pain points. He's solving people's pain points anyway. So the thing is, this is very vulnerable. And Collins, I mean, clearly he's pointing up the vulnerability of the widow in Victorian society in this situation, and the vulnerability of females. It also strikes me, look, from a feminist point of view. Clearly, I'm a man, but this is not ideal, is it, for a woman? This is a very vulnerable position. But the men are doing everything. She's just she's not, the only time she becomes an agent in her own right is when he says, come to me, come to my hotel. Oh yeah, come to my hotel. I'll look after you. And she says, no, I don't want you to fall out with Mr. Zant. So on my account. So if I go, I'll go of my own accord. Fair play to you, girl. Yeah. Girl boss. She's a tiny girl boss. She's a budding girl boss. She would have been a girl boss if we'd given her more chance. But I don't think Wilkie Collins is. Yeah, he's got this story where men rule, and it's very dangerous to look at an author's life and extrapolate from that into his stories about his character. Yeah, so I'm not going to do it. But about his thing. So. Yes, so then I think it's almost like we don't hear about the brother's sudden death. It just doesn't hang together for me, this, unless I'm misremembering, as I say again. Because we have basically John Zant not going anywhere near. Yeah, his brother dies. He gets lodgings for the lass. That's it. He doesn't go anywhere near. And then, he's a bit interested now. Mr. Rayburn's put the idea into his head. And then a bit later we hear, the brother's sudden death. Oh, right, okay. And then it's set up like he was planning this all along. And then he waits for Rayburn to suggest that she goes to him, to his house in the seaside to live with him. And he's, that's a good idea. That's like that Reservoir Dogs thing, isn't it? Torture you. Hey, that's a good idea, So, and then we get the suggestion he bumped off his brother with some sleeping drafts to do that. So, insofar as we've discussed, this is a detective story, isn't it? And remember, the Moonstone is a detective story, and in a sense, so is A Woman in White. It's not a supernatural story, and clearly he was a pal of Dickens, so he read what he read, so he was very much aware of supernatural stories. Let's have a look at Gothic elements, because it is a Gothic story. So this story relocates the traditional Gothic setting from remote castles to the familiar public space of Kensington Gardens. Uh, I actually looked at The Poetics of Space. So this is a book by a French philosopher, Gaston Bachelard, who looks at houses and places and their meanings. It's very, very continental philosophy, French. I love it, actually. But and he was talking about the meaning of Kensington Gardens versus the meaning of the lodging house versus the meaning of the seaside. Well, he wasn't, but when I kind of looked at it through that lens, that was what we were drawing out, what I was drawing out. And I like to throw these exotic things in, but ultimately didn't add too much to it. But there is something about that. So what we're going back to the old Gothic, and we're saying that, you know, this is a Gothic story which is set in a non-Gothic space. The unexpected setting enhances a sense of unease when the supernatural intrudes upon the everyday. I think this is what this story does very well. It brings the supernatural into, and this was a function of later Victorian Gothic writing. So in the 18th century, early 19th century, they're set on the continent. Think of Frankenstein, think of Castle of Otranto, 1765. Think of the Radcliffe, the Italian, Mysteries of Adolfo, all that stuff. And then later on, it gets domesticated. I've said before that the Gothic gets further domesticated in the 20th century, whereby we start seeing movies set in suburban American houses like The Conjuring. Some of those they aren't just suburban houses, are they? Though they are the Amityville Horror. But there's that one where there's that horrible thing, the old grandma running around under the house, jerk. Oh, that made me jump. That. And so, but that's a kind of a, you know, often they're big old houses in the backwoods in New England, in Maine or somewhere. But there's a domestication of the Gothic, subversion of time. This is important. Collins challenged Gothic conventions by having the ghost appear in broad daylight, disrupting the association of darkness with the supernatural. This highlights the uncanny nature of the encounter. And do you know what I think it does? And that made me think of Guy de Maupassant's The Horla, the Orla. So both of these texts, if you haven't heard it, I've done that one, go and listen to it, but not till I finish talking. Both texts, this is what I'm like when I'm narrating, you know. If you, because it takes me 3 times as long than the actual story, because I make all these mistakes and I say things in a stupid way. And I usually cut them out. Well, I always cut them out. I hope I cut them out. Both texts explore the manifestation, this is the Horla and Mrs. Zant, through tactics other than visual sensation. So Collins' ghost of her husband and Maupassant's Orla are felt presences. They're tactile, that disrupt the Victorian fin de siècle rationalist worldview. Very important. The other thing about the Victorian period, it's the apex of materialism, really. The late 19th and first half of the 20th, till it kind of gets a bit of a kicking by quantum theory. And then it's just fallen apart now. It is falling apart, materialism now. I'm watching it with glee because it's wrong. Anyway, so they use bright sunlight to heighten the uncanny nature, and it appears that the dead husband ghost, the protector ghost, actually prefers sunshine. At the end, when he appears to her in the library room, it's streaming warm sunshine. And when they're out in Kensington Gardens, I can't remember the weather, but we presume it was a nice day. So that is, I suppose, what I'm saying, that and also invisible beings existing alongside humanity central to both texts, but their implications differ profoundly. Collins suggests a comforting continuation of human consciousness after death. Yes, it's the husband, while Maupassant posits a disturbing parallel species that may supplant humanity. So the Orla is a bit more unsettling. But even so, you know, or Gothic, the female vulnerability, the classic Gothic novel has a damsel in distress has to be saved by a hero running through Kensington Gardens or Catacombs. Catacombs is a classic one. So the power of touch is a big thing in Gothic. They're very embodied Gothic tales. They're very sensual, sensory. And you're in places that are damp, and they invoke the damp, the touch, the cold. We can imagine those heavy Victorian dresses and the sound of them and things like that. So the protective spectre role subverts the traditional Gothic trope of vengeful spirits. It signifies potentially an evolution of the Gothic, but not as an evolution of the ghost, because the ghost historically can be protective. In Greek mythology, for example, there are protective shade spirits in West African folklore. Also, some of the ghosts. There's some reference to Celtic folklore with banshees as warning spirits, but I don't think that's quite the same thing. But in Chinese folklore, there are guardian ancestral spirits, and ancestral spirits tend to be protective. Japanese folklore, protective family spirits. Now, recently we were up in Scotland and we went to a Pictish site at Port Mahomac, and there'd been members of the family killed by violence by the looks of it, and they'd reburied their skulls with an ancestral skull which was much older, and that kind of suggests the idea of the ancestors being protective, and then going thousands of years further back amongst the Neolithic stuff in Orkney, in the chambered cairns and stuff, and Skara Brae, the village there. I think there, if I remember correctly, there are suggestions that sometimes they would have the ancestors' bones under their beds, or they would move around with the ancestors, and so the ancestors were, we may infer from that, protective in some way. So this idea of a ghost being protective is against Gothic tradition, or the tradition of Gothic stories, but it has parallels in older material. Let's have a look at, just quickly look at, because there are parallels between Mrs. Zant and the Ghost, published 1885, with The Woman in White, 1859. So there's 26 years between these works, and they reveal an evolution in Collins' treatment of female vulnerability. The Woman in White. Listen, if you haven't read it, these are going to be spoilers, so I suggest you put your fingers in your ears and hum, or just go la 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 until, give me 5 minutes, okay? So, get ready. Spoiler alert. The Woman in White employs what appears to be a supernatural figure, Anne Catherick, in a ghostly white dress, to expose real-world threats to women, while Mrs. Zant inverts this by using genuine supernatural presence to combat earthly danger. Both texts explore the reliability of sensation and perception. In The Woman in White, physical resemblance between Laura Fairley and Anne Catherick drives the plot through mistaken identity. I loved The Woman in White, actually. Mrs. Zant develops this theme by privileging touch over vision, suggesting that tactile sensation might prove more truthful than sight. Medical authority features in both works, but to different effect. The Woman in White depicts medical institutions as tools of patriarchal oppression. I'm sure Wilkie didn't use that word. Through the asylum system, while Mrs. Zant personalizes this threat through John Zant's professional status as a chiropodist or chiropodist. The earlier novel employs multiple narrators to gradually construct truth through accumulated testimony. The later story, Zant, maintains this technique but streamlines it, so there really are only two perspectives. There's the manuscript, which is hers, and Mr. Rayburn otherwise, I think it's first person. I can't remember now. But anyway, it's even if it's third person, it's limited to him. Shows more experimental approach to reality and perception, possibly influenced by Collins' own altered states. Laudanum. The architectural spaces in both works serve different functions. The Woman in White uses traditional Gothic settings of country houses and asylums, while Mrs. Zant domesticates the supernatural by placing it in everyday Victorian spaces like public gardens and drawing rooms. So, The Woman in White, significantly, concludes with complete rational explanation of apparently supernatural. This is the explained supernatural that we find, particularly Anne Radcliffe in the 1790s, and lots of Victorian stuff. The height of materialism, it was considered bad form to actually believe in ghosts. So you had to show, yeah, there are ghosts in this, but really they're not. As I say, it's Scooby-Doo. If it wasn't for you, pesky Mr. Rayburn and Lucy. I enjoyed doing Lucy, that pert Victorian girl. No, I won't. I enjoyed doing that. Yes, so whereas the other way around is, of course, there is a real ghost, Is the ghost integral to... I'm not sure the ghost is integral at all to Mrs. Zant and the ghost. I think we could absolutely... I mean, I suppose the key thing is, if she's just insane, that maybe has a different outcome. She would probably have to go to an asylum rather than get married. So she escapes that fate by the ghost being real. Otherwise, I'm not sure the ghost's really integral. And one of the things I always find about Wilkie Collins is, I wish he was more ghostly. He's lovely and gothic. The Haunted Hotel set in Venice. Come on, a haunted hotel in Venice. It's got to be a good story. But I remember reading it, I haven't read it for a bit, and being disappointed because I want more ghosts. That's who I am. Anyway, I'll tell you another thing I did, which I thought was really interesting. We're having book club, and somebody mentioned the Arne Thompson Uta motif analysis. So if you don't know what this is these three dudes, a Finn, a German, and an American, separately. They each elaborated the other's work. They created a library of motifs that we see in folk tales and catalogued them. That's a very Victorian thing to do, isn't it? Look at Renfield and his cataloguing of the insects and their lives. That's very, very Victorian. I'm just doing the Dracula course at the moment, so I've got Dracula very much on my mind. But Dr. Seward. But it's very Victorian, isn't it, to catalogue Darwin? Come on. Taxonomies, that's what we're talking about. Anyway, this is a taxonomy of motifs in folk stories, and I thought, I tell you what, let's just run it through that. This is AI did it for me. Oh, don't be upset. Oh, by the way, if you still got your fingers in your ears and you're going la la la, you can stop humming now and you can listen if you want to. You can switch it off if you want. And so these are the motifs. They've all got numbers, very Dewey Decimal. Another Victorian idea. So E230, return from the dead to protect the living. The central motif of the protective dead husband aligns with traditional folklore patterns of deceased spouses returning to protect their surviving partners. Yes. C228, taboo, looking at supernatural being. This story inverts the traditional motif by making the ghost invisible but tactile. Instead of, that's the scrap man, not fireworks anymore, but the scrap man. Instead of the usual prohibition against seeing a supernatural being, the emphasis is on physical sensation. Yeah, okay, a bit. N825, supernatural helper. The dead husband functions as a classic supernatural helper figure, though Collins adapts this folklore motif to Victorian literary conventions. E275, ghost manifests by touch. This represents a specific subset of ghost manifestation motifs. F1041, extraordinary physical reactions. The paralysis of John Zant by supernatural force. I suppose the ghost does that. But he could have just had a stroke. Represents a traditional motif of physical transformation or restriction through supernatural intervention. This connects to folklore patterns of divine or supernatural punishment. Okay, that is a thing I forgot to say. The role of the ghost is supernatural punishment for evil. Very important. Mostly ghosts get people to do this for them, but in some cases, particularly wicked ghosts, they can act out of malevolence and cause physical harm. But you think of Hamlet's ghost, Hamlet's father's ghost, he has to get Hamlet to do the deed, doesn't he? And that's common, but in this case, the ghost is the avenger. It's not, it's supernatural punishment for wrongdoing. Magic power from dead spouse. This is D1794.1. Father and daughter, P233, the secondary narrative thread of Rayburn and Lucy, reflects traditional folklore patterns of protective father-daughter relationships. I'll tell you why I think this was put in. I mean, it's a nice little piece, but why put it in at all to the story? It's the Save the Cat moment. So if you don't know about Save the Cat, so Blake Snyder was a screenwriter and he wrote a manual about how to write movies. And he said, to make your character likable, you've got to get him to do something nice, like save the cat. So if we have a story and somebody saves a cat, we all like that guy or girl, or whatever. And so he loves his daughter and he's delightful with his daughter, particularly against a nasty woman who wants her spanked. And he's a nice dad, eh? And he's to save the cat. We like him. John Zant doesn't do anything. He cuts people's corns off, but he does it for money. So it's not like he's doing... If he was a corn cutter, he went around cutting people's corns off, for charity, and went round the poorest people and did it out of the goodwill of his heart, that would be a Save the Cat, and we'd like him, and that would be a real battle, wouldn't it, between the one who's nice to his daughter and the one who cuts corns off for charity. But he doesn't cut corns off for charity, he charges big, particularly to that wealthy person. So that's why, I mean, I think that's neutral. We don't mind him charging for his services, because if we didn't do it, we'd all be broke. But it doesn't make us love him. Whereas, so of the two men who have competing claims on Mrs. Zant, the lovely Mrs. Zant, we like him better. So I think that's what that's about. Anyway, so as usual, a ramble through points that occurred to me with the story. But I think if I found them interesting, my plan is that you will find them interesting too. I mean, some of you don't. You're not even listening, you people. So I can say what I like about you. But the ones who do, you're still with me, aren't you? So anyway, good times. I'm busy. I've got too much on my to-do list, to be honest. So I'm going to have to offload some stuff, or else my head will burst. So, and also flipping fireworks, flipping Scrapman. It's not easy, but I do it for love and money. And that's my Save the Cat moment, totally ruined by admitting that.